What happens when the family court takes your children away and you can't do anything about it? That's what's going on in Australia today. Not only to take the children away, but take your house away, and you can be accused of crimes you did not commit, and they'll go up on your record and you never committed those crimes. Our system is broken. We are talking today to John Stapleton, who has written an incredible book about this very subject. He has been through the system himself, but he's talked to hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of men on Dads on the Air, a radio program which he was one of the co-hosts on for over a decade, and he's got some stories to tell us, and maybe he's got some answers. John is a journalist of many decades. He worked at the Sydney Morning Herald for many years, worked at the Australian, has written for many other publications as well, and he also ran an amazing radio show on independent radio starting in 2000 right through to, for I think almost 15-20 years, and called Dads on Air. And I was interviewed many times in the early years, and they've done a great job exposing the trauma and the ridiculousness and the evil of the family law system. So John, it's great to talk to you today. You have written a book, and it's a volume and a half, 603 pages, and it's like the A to Z of the evils of the family law system, starting at the very beginning when it started and how we've ended up here and all the craziness. 603 pages. How does it feel to have finished that book?
Well, it's a great relief. I just thought it was going to sink like a stone. I felt a sort of moral obligation to do it because there was so much material. I'd done a not very professionally done ebook back in 2010 when I finished working with Dads on the Air, and I honestly thought that this one would more or less vanish. It's been getting great pickup, great reviews, lots of coverage, and people have gone out of their way to help bring attention to it and to distribute it. Augusto Zimmerman just described it as a seminal work on the subject. I mean, he's a very senior professor.
He's a professor of law.
Yeah.
A very well-known professor of law from Western Australia, written many books, and he said it's a seminal work on the subject, correct?
Yes, and nobody's ever said that about anything I've written. So I must say I'm a bit taken aback, really. Pleased, of course, but, you know, yes, it's pleased on the back of a terrible tragedy for so many people. I mean, it's just so many people, and it's touched everybody in the country now. It consumes vast amounts of money. It destroys so many lives. So many people now know fathers particularly, but also mothers, wives, grandmothers who've been absolutely destroyed and had their hearts broken by this completely cruel system. I keep thinking Australians did this to other Australians. How is that possible? It's really brought incredible discredit to the public service, to the judiciary, and to the politicians who have actively protected it. You cannot go through this system without absolute disbelief at what goes on there. You cannot have any faith anymore that this government is working for its citizenry.
Yeah, look, you were telling me a story when you were at the Australian. I'm not sure, it was very early on, and a friend of yours called you down to the court to hear the story of how the judge was treating a man who had, I think he was a single dad, and he tried to contact his son who'd committed suicide, or was about to commit suicide, and the judge was cross-examining him. Can you tell us that story?
Yes, well, he had become quite active in the fatherhood movement at the time during his court case. So the court was never going to treat him very kindly because the court issues a lot of surveillance orders of its litigants and so forth, and or did it in the day. And he was unable to see his 15-year-old son, and his mother was keeping him at home, wouldn't let him go to school. So he had a 15-year-old kid basically trapped with his mum, and he tried to kill himself. And so in an affidavit, my friend had said that he wished he could be there to support his son. And he rang me up one morning. I worked only 10 minutes from the court, and he said, John, you wouldn't believe what's going on in this case. Come down. And when I arrived, I had a reporter's pad with me. Nothing stops these people. And the barrister was cross-examining him about what did you mean you wished to be there. And then the judge, who was not satisfied with the grilling that he was getting from the barrister, stepped in and said, you wanted to be there to watch, didn't you? Didn't you? You wanted to be there to watch. And he's just like, you imagine someone saying that to you, and he's just totally taken aback. And I said, and he's just saying, I beg your pardon, I just said in my affidavit I wanted to be there to comfort my son. He had just attempted to kill himself. You wanted to be there to watch, didn't you? Didn't you? It's that level of pathology and sickness that infiltrates the entire court. The whole lingering doubt thing on sexual abuse allegations. All a judge has to do is have lingering doubt, which in the mind of a lawyer can mean anything. And so any attempt by any litigant who faces those sorts of allegations on no evidence just can spend years and hundreds of thousands of dollars trying to prove their innocence, none of which works. The judge has lingering doubt, and that's the end of that story. You'll never see your children again. That was always called the atomic bomb of custody disputes. But there's so many stories in that court, and they're all heartbreaking.
They're heartbreaking. Yeah, look, I've heard many myself. I'd like to go back into the origins of the family law court, but can you tell us from your point of view as someone who's interviewed probably hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of fathers, certainly I've talked to hundreds and hundreds of fathers. Actually, I'll just tell you a bit of my own story. So we started Dads for Kids as the Fatherhood Foundation in 2002. My big dream was to encourage dads, to help dads be good dads, to work at the coalface, to encourage men in their marriages, to encourage men to, put the time in. Children spell love T-I-M-E. Children also spell love F-U-N, fun. So trying to get dads to sort of get that extra time with their kids. And we didn't know anything about the whole family law system, right? We heard a lot of bad stories over, 2 decades, but I'm happily married. I'm still happily married, thank God. And coming up for 50 years this year, John, aren't you? You're going to shake my hand? Come on.
Yeah, go on.
Years, yeah.
Good on you. You have 4 or 5 children?
5 children. 5 children. They're all doing well too, 10 grandchildren. So when we started, my wife and I, we both founded Dads for Kids together with this dream to help dads. But then we found all these dads, because we put our ads on TV, dads are ringing us up and saying, oh, can you help me? And we say, well, what do you mean? Oh, well, they tell us these horror stories of going through the family law system, the whole child support agency work, all the what happens when you get charged and all sorts of crazy stuff. What is the very worst story you've ever heard in your life, you reckon, for the family law? Is there something that comes to mind? I mean, that story is pretty bad. You just told me about that guy saying to him, he wanted to comfort his son, 15-year-old son, who just tried to commit suicide. You wanted to see him. You wanted to see him die. You wanted to see him die. It's just sick.
Well, there's so many stories. Here's one from a very well-known psychiatrist. So this psychiatrist, there were reports somehow of this family at the end of the basically the rather messy family at the end of the street, with trikes out the front and kids everywhere and dogs everywhere. And anyway, this ended up in the court, and the psychiatrist recommended that all their 4 children be removed, and the reason given was that because the parents were below average in intelligence. Now, if you were to remove the children of every person in Australia that were below the statistical average of intelligence, which is half the population, then it's an industry. The removal of children is industry. Anyway, a welfare officer ran over and killed one of the kids in the driveway of the family that one of the kids was sent to. So it's just like unbelievable.
You're serious?
Yeah.
A welfare officer?
Yes, it was backing out of the drive and ran over one of the kids. Wasn't deliberate, obviously, but that sort of thing. And they were perfectly, by all reports, messy. Some people are brought up and some people, you know what I mean. There's all sorts of different styles of parenting. Doesn't mean that they're bad parents.
No.
And those poor parents spent years and years and report after report trying to get their children back. Absolutely heartbroken, of course. No, nothing. There's just one travesty after another. What amazes me is we put in 10 years of work on Dads on the Air, and we thought in the day that all this mess was going to be resolved. These days, it's worse than ever. I wrote this book up at Sue Price's place, up at the Men's Rights Agency. I couldn't bear to just sit at home and write it, and she's 79 in a wheelchair now, and she had a husband for 52 years. And she set it up because their employees in a tyre business they had were so, was clearly so suffering from the system.
Yeah.
Anyway, there's an endless stream of people ringing up in absolute disbelief at what has happened to them. And she can tell you some absolutely appalling stories of absolutely appalling. One little one was this guy, the mother had died, just died, had cancer or something and died when the kid was really young. So Dad's bringing up the kid. Kid's now 8 years old. He complains to the school that his daughter's being bullied at school. Suddenly there's welfare officers and family court and everything all involved. They drag the kid gets promptly removed from him and the justification was that she was an Indigenous and Aboriginal, no Aboriginality in the family whatsoever. And it took years, and the kid's pleading, I want to go home, I want to see my dad, like that. It's very emotional, some of these stories, and very, very sad. And it's just reached a tipping point. They've over-egged the custard. It's just too much, and everybody knows it. The police know it. The police are fed up. It's completely destroying the reputation of the legal profession. Everybody knows it's a mess. Everybody. And the politicians.
But the crazy thing, John, is the current Labor government is making it even more of a mess. We went down to the Parliament. We spoke in the Parliament on behalf of single dads, on behalf of a fair go for men, and a fair go for children. Come on. Children are the ones that pay the price. They get removed from their father.
Everybody pays the price. Happy parents make happy kids.
Happy parents make happy kids. And so what happens is the family court make a terrible situation 10 times more terrible. Divorce is always going to be painful. Family breakup is always going to be painful. But what happens with the family law system currently, it exasperates the pain, doesn't it? It makes it so much worse.
Oh, it's ridiculous. It's adversarial in a situation where it should never have been adversarial. It's almost impossible to believe that this court was set up as a helping, caring court that was going to simplify divorce and to take out the acrimony of separation and, leave this in the hands of the lawyers. And it was determined by the High Court that it had to revert to a normal court, where one side says something and the other side says something and a judicial officer makes a determination. And it's got worse and worse and worse over the decades. There are shocking stories dating back virtually to the formation of the court. And both sides of government are guilty. Malcolm Fraser was appointed Elizabeth Evatt as the first Chief Justice. He's on the conservative side of politics. She was a radical left-wing justice and who made contributions to the Lesbian Mother's Handbook and never said a single solitary sympathetic word for fathers that anyone can ever find. Nicholson, who succeeded her, was also from the radical left, and he was appointed by Bob Hawke, that great champion of the people. In the process of doing some of this, years back when I was on the paper and writing about this subject, I rang Bob Hawke's office and got a quote from him about did he regret the appointment of Justice Nicholson. Oh, no. I mean, a man who was widely despised, you'd have to say, and not admired within the legal profession either, and who had grandstanded over these issues for decades. But anyway, I suppose for a younger generation, they don't know a lot of this history and these characters who have dominated the field for so many years don't mean much anymore. But you'll notice the court doesn't make the headlines like it used to. And that's very deliberate too. You know, it's a concealed crime essentially. The whole damn thing. Everyone knows it's crooked from so many angles. Not least the family reports that are relied on, the psychiatrists and the so-called experts that are relied on. You know, you want a standard tactic for a psychiatrist writing a family report. This is just. Lots of people report this behaviour. So the psych gets the kids, sits them on the couch and says, so what does mummy want? And the kids say, mummy wants us to live with them. So then the psych writes up, children want to live with their mother. That's just a standard sleight of hand deceit that goes on and on and on. Because all those psychs who make millions of dollars, millions, and have heavy legal backing, all know that they're very, very lucrative trade. You can pay, back in the day it was like $2 or $3 grand, now it's like 5 or 6 or whatever it is now. A very lucrative trade. You know, one report, the guys, they demonstrably proved that that extracts of that family report recommendation came word for word, like it was plagiarised out of a book called Feminist Jurisprudence, which is famous for that line, facts are just weapons that men use to batter women and perpetuate the system. I mean, it's that Marxism, the
cultural Marxism.
Cultural Marxism that we were talking about before we went on air. Facts are irrelevant. People used to look at me askance when I said it's a Marxist feminist court, but I don't think anyone even it's just accepted now that that's the court.
It's a Marxist feminist court.
It's
yeah.
a Marxist
We're
feminist
going to
court.
go there, but just let me one more story, and it just this is in your book. It's page 461. Let me read it. In March, just to prove that nothing had really changed, a Melbourne father of 3. Now this was back in 2009, right? Was jailed for sending a birthday card to his daughter.
Correct.
The man, Mick, who could not be identified for legal reasons, was locked up in a suburban police station for 7 nights and spent another in the tough Melbourne custody centre. Mick claimed he was a victim of family court bias. I was jailed for 9 days and 8 nights for sending my 11-year-old daughter a birthday card. He said, apparently I broke an intervention order. It's ludicrous and it breaks your heart. The 51-year-old was estranged from his wife and claims she has brought a series of intervention orders against him, banned him from contact with his children without any evidence. Until my wife divorced me, I was a legally unimpeachable citizen. Now I'm being treated like a criminal just because I want some contact with my kids. He said, and that contact was ended arbitrarily without even a hearing or the presentation of evidence. In a court of law, if you're accused of something, you are supposed to have the ability to cross-examine your accusers and call witnesses. In the secret chambers of the family court, you are not guaranteed that at all. Mick said the experience cost him $20,000. It's a plundering and looting exercise on the part of lawyers involved in this, and there are no juries or scrutiny by media to keep them accountable. That man rang me on the phone as a distressed dad, so I know this story personally.
Oh, right.
I wrote about it in my daily, my weekly Fathers Online email, but you actually have told the story, and obviously he was in contact with you, correct? It's in your book.
Yes, I forget the actual source of that. I can't recall whether I spoke to him or not.
But I reckon you would have had him on the Dads on the Air.
Yes, quite likely. Yes.
Yeah, I think you had.
Yes.
I think you had Mick on Dads on the Air,
Right.
And that's why it makes your book. But they're the sort of stories, just shocking stories. A man goes to jail for 9 days. What's the crime?
Sending a birthday
card to his daughter. He was 11 years of age. He had constant contact with his children. There was a breakup, and yet there was no evidence presented, no real facts presented, but he was then just shut away from his kids.
Here's another story, and this involves, because we've got so many migrants in the country now, and this is an Indian gentleman, and he came out here with his wife. They broke up. She went back to India. She had various mental issues, I understand. And so the daughter stayed with Dad. Then, quite some years later, she decides all the way from India that she would like to see the daughter. So it ends up in the Family Court of Australia, and the judge orders him to write to, because they wanted some supervision of her when she saw the child, and wrote to his parents, the child's grandparents, to see whether or not they would be prepared to have the child stay with them while the mother came and visited, so that they could reacquaint after all those years. So he writes to his parents in English, gets back into the court. The court goes, "You've written to your parents in English. Why didn't you write in Hindi?" And he said, "My parents have multiple degrees. My father is a professor of English, and my mother also has a doctorate in English," and they jailed him. Now,
they jailed him?
Yes, because he didn't write to his parents in Hindi. This is the madness. There's another mad story. Here's another mad one. So this guy is he's finally got to see his kids after this big drama. So he's driving to see his children after 6 months or something, not having seen them. There's a car accident. He's with a friend. There's a car accident. His friend is killed. He's permanently disabled. He ends up in the hospital. He's pleading with the mother to please let me see the children. They wouldn't see him. This gets into the family court. They decide that because he's disabled, he has to pay his entire bulk of child support all at once because he won't be able to earn an income. Fast forward to when I came across the case, he's about to lose his only possession, which is a humble house in rural Victoria, literally about to lose the house with his child support. The kids by now are 20-something, don't need child support.
Are you serious?
Yes, and about to lose his house over this. And he contacted me and told the whole story. I've seen all the documentation for these stories. You want to hear another one?
One more.
The Child Support Agency, which is notorious, of course, rings up this guy. He's absolutely heartbroken, staying with his sister, lost everything. The blokes lose everything. The country's now full of men living in caravan parks, that's if they haven't nicked themselves, living in caravan parks, living out of their car, totally heartbroken, totally destroyed. And so he's living at his sister's place. He can't see his 4 children. He's a very loving person, very loving dad. I think it was 3 or 4 children, sorry. And anyway, so he can't see his kids. He's heartbroken. He's paying his child support. The child support, his sister said he'd been so depressed, but he'd been picked up. He was picking up, and he'd just been to the doctor, and the doctor said he seems to be improving. He's less depressed than he was. The child support agency rings up while the sister's out and says, "You've overpaid your child support by $800. And he said, "Oh, great. When do I get the money?" And they said, "You can't have the money. You can either gift it to your wife or it will go to the state. You cannot have your money back." So he goes out into the shed, drinks a can of poison, which some weed killer or something, and he corrodes your stomach. So it took him 20 days to die, a very painful death. And the sister, I saw all the documentation, the sister's just heartbroken because she loved her brother and he was a very loving guy. These stories are insane. And there's so many of them. Sorry, very emotional they are. Very shocking. They really are shocking.
Oh, mate, yeah. Now, look, I know how you feel because, you know, many days...
I got too emotional, sorry.
Many days I'd be at work and I'm, you know, working on a newsletter and a dad brings me up and starts telling me these stories. I'm just bawling my eyes out, listening to these stories. Story after story after story. You know, people say, oh, these men lie. But once you've heard 200 or 300 stories and they're all about the same, they're all roughly, you know, these sort of variants of the theme of bias and just horrific treatment. You would not, I maintain, you wouldn't treat your dog like men get treated in the family law system, would you?
No, and they get dismissed as aggrieved litigants by media and by academics.
Yeah. You wouldn't even treat your enemies like these men get treated by the system. Yeah. Now, let's just go back here. Let's just talk a bit about, because Bettina's done a really good job of talking to you about the book, but I'd like to go back to how this started. I can remember talking to you, this is way back in 2003, 2004, and you were one of the first people to talk to me about the Bolsheviks and how the child support system was actually inspired by the Russian Bolshevik system, which is a shocking system, if you know anything about Russia. And even the family law court had its roots in this whole cultural Marxist sort of deal. Now, you've got a section in your book about that. Do you want to read that to us? Sure. I think it's quite interesting.
Yes.
And you actually...
Because we have the same percentages here now, 100 years later, you know, the 18% for one child and so on and so forth. We're already a heavily taxed country.
Yeah.
There's another story, that guy, this made the Canberra Times, of the guy that was losing 80% of his income, this one did have 4 children and multiple letters, made the New York Times, front page of the Canberra Times, sorry, and he went to, gassed himself in his garage holding a child support agency letter. The child support agency claimed they were treating him fairly. I mean, it just goes on and on and on.
I think it's
on and on and on.
I think this is page 89.
Right, so I'll just read this.
Yeah, just read it. I think it's very, very profound.
It all began a long time ago. Most of those then in senior positions within the media and in government were in or around universities and the burgeoning of secondary education in the late 60s and early 70s. Many hadn't altered their views since Germaine Greer published her bestseller The Female Eunuch in 1970. Women's studies. I did women's studies, being a progressive kind of guy. It's hard to believe.
Because you come from the left, don't you? You were actually on the left side of the whole political spectrum back in those days.
I don't know. We all thought Gough Whitlam walked on water and had saved us from Vietnam and all the rest of it, you know.
Keep going.
But, you know. Anyway, women's studies, which morphed into gender studies, same thing, were in their foundation years. The Marxist feminist style of family courts, which were birthed in the academic corridors of America's universities in the 1970s, spread rapidly across the Western world and were adopted with alacrity by Australia's legal fraternity, its phalanx of bureaucrats and legions of toady academics, all happy to suck up the money being hoisted around on the latest intellectual fad. What was once the cutting edge, widely supported by many men, became in its playing out in family courts, social welfare departments, armadas of domestic violence advocates, and all the hundreds of millions, well indeed billions, worth of supporting bureaucracies, a shock to many of its many original male supporters. One of my childhood ambitions, God bless my younger self, was to understand everything. Thus I ended up studying philosophy at one of Sydney's red brick universities. Fortunately for me, it was the philosophy of the philosophy department that everything was valid, and so I struggled through. Each year, one of our lazier professors would set an essay for Shulamith Firestone's The Dialectics of Sex, The Case for Feminist Revolution, also first published in 1970. The basic tenets of the book was that for true liberation, all traces of the patriarchy needed to be excised from women's lives. And that's why they have no regret when the fathers are out. This is progress. This is social progress.
Yep.
Firestone described the biological family as tyranny, quote unquote, her particular innovation being to include gender in traditional Marxist analysis of social power structures. In the opening paragraphs of the Dialectics of Sex, Firestone wrote, quote, "If there were another word more all-embracing than revolution, we would use it. To so heighten one's sensitivity to sexism presents problems far worse than the black militants' new awareness of racism. Feminists have to question not just all of Western culture, but the organisation of culture itself, and further even, the very organisation of nature. Many women give up in despair. Others continue strengthening and enlarging the movement, their painful sensitivity to female oppression existing for a purpose, eventually to eliminate it." End quote. Fast forward 50 years to the 2020s, and Firestone might as well be the Prime Minister of Australia, her beliefs having lurched out of the academy to become all-pervasive in the nation's institutions. Raised on a diet of this sort of rhetoric and now in senior and powerful positions in the bureaucracy, graduates of the 1970s, and of course it went on, 80s, so on, saw themselves as righting historical wrongs. And there you have it.
This is the reality is, and this book shows that the whole of the family law system, the whole of our jurisprudence when it engages with families, comes from Karl Marx. And Karl Marx had some devotees in Russia, and they realised that they had to change their tax, and because they had to find a way to, they needed a way to sort of destroy the traditional family. And so you were telling me this way back in the day. I didn't know anything really about, Karl Marx, cultural Marxism. I didn't know anything about, this long march through the institutions of the cultural Marxists. And for those who mightn't understand, some of our listeners mightn't know this, but cultural Marxism started in Russia under Stalin because they all thought that the whole world would be swept with the revolution, the workers would rise up. But they couldn't do it in the West. They could only do it in a few countries where there was really terrible power imbalances. And so they realised they had to change their tune. So what they needed to do was to go in and basically destroy the family, destroy the church, destroy the government, destroy the judicial system, and destroy the whole of the culture, the cultural norms of society. And Gramansky was one of those early guys, if I understand correctly. And then they got kicked out of Russia by Stalin. They went to Frankfurt in the 30s and they established the Frankfurt School. And Hitler hated them so much because some of them were Jewish, as you pointed out to me earlier. But nonetheless, he hated them so much that he kicked them out of Germany. And so you had to get pretty evil to be kicked out of Germany. And they ended up in New York, they ended up in California universities because they're all very...
Berkeley in particular.
Berkeley in particular.
Marcuse was at Berkeley, one-dimensional man.
Then they wrote the playbook in the 50s and the 60s for what we've listened to, what's taught in gender studies, and which became the playbook for the whole, the feminist sort of revolution, inverted commas, if whatever you want to call it, and the whole sort of the freedom movement, which was infected by Trotskyists. Back in the day, by the way, John, my best friends were either Trotskyists, Marxists, Leninists, Maoists, or anarchists. And so I was embedded in that whole, the whole cultural counter scene. And I was very much aware of that side of it, but I didn't realise that it was the foundation for the family law court. Just talk a bit about that.
Well, what comes to mind, is that the Australian Family Court led the world in this whole gender transitioning. One case by Nicholson, which made news all around the world, was a 13-year-old girl who wanted to become a boy without the approval of her parents. Yeah. Now, it was such an unusual case that it... and so groundbreaking that it literally made headlines all around the world. You fast forward to the present, it just came out in Queensland, there are 600 kids going through this transitioning with all the the amount of, I'm on some meeting where these guys are transitioning, it takes huge amounts of hormones and voice therapy and surgery and
Yeah.
everything else. It's major. It's I did a university essay on drag queens, and it was a really rare phenomenon, like really, really rare. And they all said much the same thing, that they felt like they'd been born into the wrong body. Now it's become a social contagion, and it's incredibly damaging. And 600 in Queensland, I haven't got the figures in front of me, but hundreds in every state.
Oh, hundreds, yeah.
Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds. You can never go back. To unwind some of these surgeries is either impossible or extremely difficult.
Yeah.
All the academic research is on the bravery and courage of people who wish to transition and all the problems they have. Nobody, because there's no money in it, ever studies the difficulties that they have when they realise they've made the worst mistake of their life. And that they've lost any ability to have children, there's been trissy boys and butch girls since the beginning of time, and they are what they are. But this social contagion, when you talk about these sort of things as being evil, it has that true feel about it. It's evil, that you couldn't come up with something more damaging or more dysfunctional. And is that theory there? We have to overcome not just society but nature itself. That's where some of this ideology
it comes from the cultural Marxists. I'm just reading here, Murphy, for those who don't know, Lionel Murphy was the guy that basically designed the family law legislation, brought it in 75, 76. Undergoff Whitman was passed, and it was a horror story of horror stories. But Murphy's protege, Senator Gareth Evans, says this: former president of the Humanist Society and key advocate of the infamous Bill of Rights, was himself once quoted as saying, "Children want a right to sexual freedom and education and protection from the influence of Christianity." What do you make of that?
Well, there's a very strong anti-Christian, anti-family thing about it. Of course, one of the reasons why we've copped this enormous level, like historically high levels of immigration, that is to destroy the traditional culture of the country, a lot of which was Christian. But funnily enough, the Muslims are as much or more pro-family than anybody. It's also an incredibly racist and sexist legislation, as various people over time has pointed out. It's racist because all you've got to say now is, if you're going through a battle in the family court, is that you're Indigenous, and they go, "Oh yes, children and family are very important to the Indigenous. Yes, of course you can see your children." I have a friend who did that. Bang. Couldn't see his kids, heartbroken, blah, 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 blah. And then just went, "Yeah, but I'm Indigenous." And he did have some legitimacy to the claim, but these days, of course, you can claim anything. But yeah, there was legitimacy to that claim. Bang, got the kids. The Sudanese that we have here don't have a structure, a normal family structure of nuclear families, so they're not impacted. The kids grow up shortly with mum, and then very quickly they're sent off to live with a brother or the uncle or something like that. That's the way they operate, and that's their traditional culture. The Muslims, in the very and they're very pro-family, but in the very unfortunate circumstance where there is a family breakdown, the children live with mum until they're 7, and then they go and live with dad. And that's just in the culture. So we are putting through basically the poor white trash, or the white people, through this system, which makes it incredibly racist. It's also incredibly sexist, because we're assuming a traditional model where mums stay at home. The average mum will stay on welfare after separation for at least 12 years, and that destroys any chance of functioning normally in the society. Whereas a lot of women are working these days, men and women are both working, they're both sharing the care of the kids, but when it comes to separation, suddenly you're sentencing this woman to a lifetime of welfare and dependency, because that's what it's driven by money, And
Driven by money, yeah. Professor Manning Clark, in to point about the fact that this very anti-Christian, this family law system, Professor Manning Clark was quoted as saying of his friend, the late Justice Lionel Murphy, who was basically the guy. He was a hard left guy in the Whitlam government, and he was the Attorney General, and he basically formulated the whole family law system. It had been one of Murphy's aims to dismantle the Judeo-Christian ethic of Australian society. Well, I would say he's done a pretty good job of that, wouldn't you say?
Oh, yes. I mean, the whole truth is relative bizzo and everything. Truth's not relative. It's either true or it's not true. All of that. Yes, I think so.
Because let me put my thesis to you about the family law, and this is after years and years and years of talking. It was influenced by Mark Whittaker too, I might add. But my thesis is that there's no such thing as no-fault divorce. Someone's at fault. Maybe it's half, maybe it's quarter, three-quarters. But the bottom line is that divorce there's some sort of level of faults, whether it's neglect or apathy or in some cases domestic violence, right? So, and they're not a lot of cases. It's mostly just people don't look after their relationship and don't care for one another. They drift apart, and then they find the man maybe finds someone more attractive, or the woman finds a man who's more attractive, and they break that vow of that they made to be faithful. Now, Lionel Murphy hated the Christian thought that marriage was something holy. He hated the idea that you could be accused of adultery and that adultery had to be right. So he made it right because there was no such thing as fault. Now, the problem with that is there is no such thing as a court without fault. The new fault became the male of the species. And so what's happened right now is the whole system is weighted against the male, and a lot of these people that work in the system don't even realise it. And I'll give you a quote from Mark Whittaker from Cairns. Mark Whittaker has done a lot of work in the family law system. You might remember Mark. And he was chatting one day back with John Howard, and he told me this story. He was chatting with John Howard, and John Howard said to Mark, "What's wrong with the family law system?" Because you look at the actual laws, and the theory is that if they're applied fairly and correctly, things should work out okay. The system is based on a wrong precept, which of course is no-fault divorce, but arguably they tried to make it easier for people, right? But in making it easier, it became worse. And, his answer to John Howard was, look, it's the culture of the family law courts there's a problem. It's not so much the law itself, although the law is defective, and I think you would agree, I would both agree on that, because it comes from this cultural Marxist sort of destroy the patriarchy, destroy the nuclear family, let's pull them apart, let's rip them apart sort of thesis. But he said it's the actual culture of the court. Now, you've given us quite a few examples in our discussion of how bad the system is, how it's weighted against men, but the system doesn't even realise it because it's just become embedded. It's just become the actual culture, how they operate. They don't have any other sort of frame of reference, correct?
Quite. It's yes. Well, no one goes near the family court and expects to be treated reasonably. How can we have a system which asset strips fathers, asset strips them, destroys their purpose for living, destroys any relationship with their children? And it's not just fathers either.
Mothers get destroyed.
Oh, absolutely destroyed.
Just before you say that, I remember hearing a story of a mother, and she was, I think she was Asian, and her husband was Asian, but he had a lot of money, and she was cut off. And he had money to go to court, so he paid a lot of money for a barrister to make her look like she was stupid. She was cut off from her children, and a friend of mine who worked in the Dads in Distress, he would go around and just check up on her, every couple of weeks and see how she was doing. He knocked at the door one time, and there was no answer, and he was very worried. He opened the door, and there she was. She'd put a gun to her head, and she'd pulled the trigger, and she had been locked out of the family home. She couldn't see her children, and she killed herself in desperation. Now, the reality is that's usually 85% of men who pull the gun and the trigger, but women are also disadvantaged by the system because in some ways too, it's who's got the most money can sway the court, correct, John?
Yes, well, no one benefits by being rewarded for lying. It's not called the Palace of Lies for nothing. It's a completely dysfunctional and dishonest jurisdiction. And the more extreme your claims, the more successful you're likely to be. I really believe it should be the entire money thing needs to be completely removed from it. It's hard to believe it. The original claims about it anyway was that it was to be a helping and caring court and to diffuse the animosity of separation. And it's really hard to believe that that was the original motive, and that joint custody was the original motive. Because it's just never been. The court very rapidly became a law unto itself, and it's been an absolute failure of democracy. There was a huge effort, surprisingly, under Paul Keating in 1995 to bring back the whole joint custody thing. The court, the level of, which was always low, 3 to 5, the level of joint custody orders went down. We had the whole reform movement with Howard, and while there was some move upwards at one time, it's all gone now.
But let's just talk about how it went. I mean, I saw an improvement with those because you and I were fighting for those family law changes in 2006. You and I were very unhappy with them. Yes. But I noticed, and I'm sure you noticed, that there was an improvement afterwards. There was actually a more improvement than I would have thought. In court orders, I saw more men seeing their children than before. But fast forward to 2011, and you've got a situation where, what's her name, the female Prime Minister, Labor Prime Minister?
Julia Gillard.
Julia Gillard brought in 2011, took out the line at being perjury.
Yes, no perjury. You can make any claim you like because women don't lie about violence.
Well, yeah, women don't lie about, but no, it took perjury out of the family law, which had been brought back in under John Howard. No one had ever been charged, but what it did with that change with John Howard, which was voted by both Labor and Liberal, it was a conscience vote, and that's how they should be in Parliament. It was a conscience vote, and both the left and the right agreed together to bring back a possible charge of perjury. Well, fast forward to 2011, and Julia Gillard took that out of the family law. And apparently, according to judges and according to people within the family law system, the lies and the false accusations just went through the roof. But right now, it's got to a really serious point. Tell us right now where it stands in the family law system now.
Well, there's been two incredibly complex and incredibly nasty pieces of legislation passed through Parliament by the Labor Party, the 2023 and then 2024
And we, by the way, that's for kids.
Bills.
I went down there with Aboriginal pastor James Dargan. I went down there with one of Wayne Butler's top young female lawyers, who herself was a feminist, a very intelligent woman, and myself and James Dargan, and we fought against that. We spoke in the Parliament. And, the Labor members that were there just looked in their nose at us, didn't even bother to listen to us, couldn't care less. The Greens the same, because the Greens, a lot of people think the Greens are very fair, but the Greens, by nature, absolutely hate men and hate the so-called patriarchy, which happens to be anyone that's got that's a male. And so, we fought, but they just didn't listen to us, John. Keep going.
I want to read, because you've been talking about cultural Marxism so much, the final chapter of this book is called At the End of the Long Road, the long march, at the end of the long march, the long march for the institutions that you were talking about earlier. So I just want to read this section from the end of the book. The Marxist feminist-derived ideology which has driven the Family Law Act, the Family Court and the Child Support Agency, enmeshed with the education system, has inexorably led to a totalitarian outcome, step by terrible step. In a totalitarian society, traditional family structures face significant erosion as the state seeks to supplant familial loyalty with loyalty to the regime through indoctrination and policies that prioritise state needs over family bonds. personal and familial privacy is frequently invaded. State control over marriage, reproduction and child-rearing practices transforms the family from a natural social unit into an instrument for state propaganda and control. The abuses the Australian government has meted out to the citizenry over the past 50 years defies belief. What is morally indefensible is the failure to act on the part of those who were in a position to do so, those who held the political power and could have actually wrought positive change to this wretched jurisdiction. Abandon all hope, ye who enter here. In a totalitarian society, children's minds are often subjected to intense indoctrination, where education and propaganda are used to instill loyalty to the state and its ideology, often suppressing critical thinking and individual identity in favour of conformity. Children are systematically isolated from alternative viewpoints, with their development focused on service to the state rather than personal growth or family values. This can lead to a generation that, while unified in its adherence to the regime, may lack the ability to think independently or question authority, potentially suffering from fear, paranoia, a fragmented sense of self, and without natural affection. And in the Bible,
It says that, doesn't it?
it exactly says that in the end days there will be no, you would know the line exactly, I think, but without normal family affection.
Yeah,
And we see that
yeah.
everywhere.
And as we finish up, I just want to talk a bit about that. And you talked about the fact that what's now transitioned, where we are right now in the family law system, is that evidence, you are guilty, and even if proven innocent. So, you know, the normal law, under English common law, which we've had for 400 or 500 years, which goes back to a very strong Christian heritage, means that you are innocent until proven guilty. Now you are guilty until proven innocent, and even if you're proven innocent, you're still guilty. Explain that.
Well, the legislation that was rammed through Parliament, the Family Law Legislation Amendment Bills 2023 and 2024, which was jammed through with 27 other bills on the one day.
Late at night.
Late at night, of course.
Dirty deeds done dirt cheap, eh?
Oh, absolutely. Was altered 7 other acts so that in a family court, you know, it's the Evidence Act, not that evidence had much to do with it anyway, but they only need the Evidence Act as you can dispense with that altogether. Unnecessary. So there is no concrete evidence. No, these things were jammed through with minimal public debate. Where it's not democracy. This is not democracy.
And it's not. It is not proper jurisprudence either, is it?
No. It's just farcical. And then you bring in this whole new trend of coercive control, which in the hands of a lawyer can mean absolutely anything. You can go to jail in Queensland for, I think it's 15 years or something, for something called coercive control. Same in New South Wales. It's absurd. The whole thing has become a really sad, messy, ridiculous and exploitative realm. So if you can possibly avoid it, do not go there.
You know, as I was preparing for this interview, I just looked up the scriptures to find out, because as you know, I'm a person that believes in the Bible.
Yes.
But our whole system of jurisprudence, as I said earlier, was written on the basis of the Old Testament law, which basically said you are innocent until people can prove you guilty, right? I just want to read it for you. It says here in Deuteronomy chapter 13, verse 15, one witness is not enough to convict a man accused of any crime or offence he may have committed. So he might have committed the offence. People might think he committed the offence, but one witness is not enough to convict him. A matter must be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. And it talks about the Pharisees in the New Testament wanted to kill Jesus, and Nicodemus, who ultimately was a friend of Jesus, said to the Pharisees, doesn't our law say you can't convict a man unless he has a hearing? So we have a history, if you like, of fairness and And I mean, if I was said, oh, you know, John killed so and so, and you're going to say, no, I didn't. And it's only one person that says it, me, and I might have been on drugs that day, who knows, right? And I take you to court and you get the electric chair. If you're in America, you could get the electric chair for it. Well, that would be wrong, wouldn't it? It'd be simply wrong. But right now, a man goes to court, and particularly with this latest thing that's happening in Queensland, it's happened now in New South Wales, which is this coercive control. Oh, I felt like he controlled me. I felt like he didn't like me. I felt like he had the money. I felt like there was no proof. There's no, witnesses. There's no proof. There's no. What you can end up in jail, can't you?
I think it's important to recognise that the police themselves are utterly fed up with this. There were many, many police involved in the early days of the fatherhood movement in Australia because they're as heartbroken as everybody else and as outraged by a system which they dedicated their life to, and then it turns around and destroys them. But these days, in this he said, she said nonsense that goes on constantly, the profession itself is becoming downgraded. Someone kicks a watering can and suddenly they're out of the house, and she's doing that because she fancies the man next door, or just growing restless in the marriage or whatever. And the police are really unhappy with becoming the feminist enforcers. And it's not the normal feminism that we used to understand of equality, which is, go girl. It's become this madness. And the police themselves are really fed up with it because it's completely degraded their entire profession, and they know perfectly well when they go around or enforce these actions that there are some high conflict and low conflict couples, but almost invariably it's not extreme violence or anything. It's just that people have grown apart, and they're fed up with being used as tools to make, in this money game of lawyers, and grab all the property and grab all the assets and grab all the income. And a young man now with a happy family can have his life turned upside down. All she has to do is ring the police station and say, I feel frightened. They'll go down around to his work and tell him that, mate, you can't go home, but I own the house. Doesn't matter, mate. He will lose his house, his kids, his station in life, etc., etc. If he has a domestic violence order against him and is a security officer or something, he may well lose his job. These people are utterly destroyed. We're destroying ourselves. The society is destroying itself.
You said to me, Warwick, we live in the rubble.
Yes, we do, don't we? It's just terrible.
But what can we do? Is there anything what could you say to people listening to us today? Is there anything you could tell them? What would you say to them?
I think the institutions have reached a point where that they cannot be redeemed. I think the legislation needs to be changed back to the original intent of joint custody. You both made them, you can both look after them, and I think all the financial incentives need to be removed. Those financial incentives,
taken out of the system.
You should provide for your children, for child support, etc. Well, it never achieved that. Children get less money now than before the Child Support Agency was created. The state has saved no money. It costs like $5 for every dollar you collect, or whatever the current figure is.
So it's actually costing billions and billions of dollars. The current system is costing billions of dollars, and less money is going to the children, correct?
And major driver of unemployment, because these blokes, there's no point in working. So, I know one barrister who, he became a barrister after it because there was no point in working. There's no point in working when you not only just paying high taxes as a normal Australian, you have to work half the year before you're claiming making any money for yourself these days. It's just ridiculous levels of taxation.
My advice to men is you have to be careful who you vote for, and sometimes it's the lesser of two evils. And you've got to basically be very careful with your votes and put them in the right place for starters. But look, I think we've got to start where we can with our own families, and that's one of the reasons I'm very thankful for my wife. She's put up with me now for 49 years, 50 years later this year. She
might even love you never know.
She might even love me. She does love me. And I think we've got to work together to build a better Australia. But certainly, as you said, these institutions have got to go. Is that right?
Oh yeah, I think it's irredeemable now. It's gone way too far. They're way too destructive. They've destroyed so many people. Nobody respects them anymore. Everybody knows, the politicians, the lawyers, the bureaucrats, anyone with any modicum of decency knows that this is out of control, ridiculous, and it's incredibly destructive, and it just has to go. And just revert back to the joint custody. You guys work it out. Remove the financial incentives. Abolish the child support agency because it never succeeded any of its goals. Abolish the whole motive that you get the house, the kids, and everything else that goes with it. You get the kids, and then you get the house, and then you get the child support, and then you get the family payment benefit A and B, and on and on it goes. It all just has to be cut out.
Scrapped and start again.
Scrapped.
Yeah.
Yeah.
First of all, I want to say thank you, John, for talking to us today. And this is a book that if you're interested in this subject, this 603 pages. John's been there. He's been in the trenches. I was there with him for a part of that time. He goes right back to the 70s. He looks at all the cases and looks at all the different parts of the system where it went wrong. And if you want to get this book, Angus and Robertson apparently has got the best price. You'll get it quicker. You can get it at Amazon. But Angus and Robertson here in Australia, you will get it. And again, thank you for listening to us today, and all the best.